Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 36 of our reading of Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, 26 Unforgivable Explorations into the Realm of the Supernatural. And we will be going over the copyright information, which should be on your screen right now. Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone is copyright 1963 by Cayuga Productions Incorporated. Rod Serling's Twilight Zone Revisited is copyright 1964 by Cayuga Productions Incorporated. All rights reserved. This 1983 edition is published by Bonanza Books, distributed by Outlet Book Company, Incorporated, a Random House company, and the address is there if you want it. This book was previously published as two separate works entitled Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone and Rod Serling's Twilight Zone Revisited. Printed and bound in the United States of America, and the Library of Congress information is right there if you want it. Anyways, in the last episode, we were reading about the Dixie Bells, which was a steamer ship, I believe. And the captain was John, I believe. Honest John or Quiet John or something like that. I don't exactly remember, but something strange is probably going to happen. This is the last time that John is going to be the skipper or the captain of this particular boat. So we're going to find out what happened. He has some kind of uncanny ability to read the sea. So let's continue. Silent John, that was his name. Dave went out and down past the Texas cabins, which were just below and behind the pilot house. The last door was ajar, and Dave could hear muttering that sounded like Matt as the gambler packed his carpet bag. Dave continued down to the galley, where he decided to have his coffee and pie before they reached Cedar Landing. But he had hardly ordered them when he heard the clang of bells, calling for the stoppage of the engines. Next, the whistle throated a huge blast, and the Dixie Bell drifted with the current. Dave stepped out into the stern of the boiler deck, just as the bow of the yaw poked from the fog. A rower tossed the end of the rope up to the deckhands, who held it tight while the passengers came aboard. Captain Hoskins, who was standing by, expressed his admiration. "Silent John has done it again. By cracky. I hope he's taught you to be half as good as he is, Dave, my boy." Stopping right off the landing in a fog so thick a bobcat would have to claw his way through it. "By cracky, we'll miss him after this trip." The yawl was getting ready to row away, but Captain Hoskins bawled to the deckhands, "Hold that rope! We're putting a man ashore." Then, as the bells clanged for the engines to start, the captain demanded, "Where in tarnation is Matt Kiley?" Paddle wheels were churning slowly, swinging the Dixie Bell into the current. The men in the yawl were getting fidgety, and within the next few minutes, Captain Hoskins became frantic. "Get up to the pilot house," he exclaimed to Dave. "Tell Silent John to hold it. I don't want him raising hob because we still have Kiley on board." Dave started up the next deck only to meet Matt coming down carrying his bag. Dave made way, and a few minutes later, Matt had reached the stern, where a pair of deckhands swung him over the railing into the yawl and tossed his bag in after him. The rope released and the yawl was swallowed by the fog, the last impression being Matt's bearded face glowering out of the swirl into the reflection of the deck lights, like some demon delivering its last defiance. Now the Dixie Bell was really making her way downriver, as though Silent John intended to get the most out of the packet, fog or no fog. Dave noticed it and grinned while he was having his pie and coffee in the galley. "We're riding the current," he told the worried steward, "and since no one will be bucking it, Silent John knows that the way is clear. But what if some pilot sorry. Well, some pilot coming upstream has lost his way. If he's that dumb, assured Dave, he's the type that would tie up for the night somewhere. The steward still wasn't convinced. He cocked his head and said anxiously, "Listen." From outside came a musical sound of a steam calliope playing the familiar strains of "Oh, Susanna." Dave stepped to the door and saw a blur of light so powerful that they managed to penetrate the fog, somewhere on the shore. "That's the showboat Happy Days," Dave identified it. "We must be passing Bonneville, 3 miles below Cedar Landing. We've tied up at the Bonneville Wharf and are putting... Dave tied up at the Bonneville Wharf and are putting on a show there. But aren't we running close inshore?" "Only because the current is," replied Dave, and the music faded off into the distance. "We'll be out in midstream soon." Dave finished his pie and ordered another cup of coffee. He was taking his last swallow just as the galley clock reached 2 minutes of 8. This was one night where he would be punctual in getting back to the pilot house, so he started up only to pause on the companionway. The Dixie Bell seemed to sidle as she sped along, as though only partly in the current. From dead ahead came the blast of a steamboat whistle, which Silent John should have answered, unless he happened to be trying to place it in the fog. Again it blared, still dead ahead and very close. Now it was too late for Silent John to answer. Frantically, Dave made a dash for the pilot house, though he knew that he would be too late also. It was where he belonged and where he needed, or had been needed. Regardless of that, the pilot house was where he intended to be found, along with Silent John. Such was Dave's devotion, both to his duty and his chief. Dave Shelby reached the Texas deck just as the crash came. Big though the Dixie Bell was, the other packet was bigger. Dave recognized her as the Colossus, a river giant that lived up to its name. The Dixie Bell, coming full steam downstream, might as well have struck solid rock. The bow of the Dixie Bell telescoped. Her superstructure smashed as it met that of the Colossus. The twin smokestacks of the Dixie Bell tumbled backwards like falling towers, one landing across the pilot house, demolishing it. Smoke was pouring everywhere, and shrieks were coming from cabins above the hiss of steam. Heedless of all that, Dave clambered to the roof of the Texas and peered into the ruin of the pilot house. He saw Silent John stretched amid the debris between a broken three-legged stool and pot-bellied stove that had overturned, spilling its live coals across the floor. Dave squeezed through the window, grabbed up a poker that lay beside the pilot's hand, and used it to scrape the coals into the corner, where he crunched them beneath his foot to prevent a fire. But when he looked at Silent John, Dave saw that he was beyond help. The veteran pilot was either dying or already dead from a great gash in the side of his forehead, which had covered his face with a mass of blood. The locked steamers were drifting downriver, but the lower decks of the Dixie Bell were already awash, and her crew were scrambling on board the Colossus, while deckhands were using axes to chop the boats apart. Grimly, Dave Shelby stayed in the pilot house where he belonged, confident that the wreck of the Dixie Bell would go aground next shore. Yet, all the while, the thought was running through Dave's mind that if he had reached the pilot house before the fatal hour of 8, he might have prevented this tragedy. For now, as the fog drifted about the sinking Dixie Bell, Dave was sure that Silent John must have let his thoughts wander far away, as he so often did on such nights. So far away that Silent John had forgotten he was on the Mississippi and had failed to hear the warning whistle of the approaching Colossus. There was another man who could have testified to that same singular fact. His name was Hiram Moreland, and he was dozing in front of the fireplace in the upstairs parlor of his home in Newberry, Indiana. When he heard the town hall clock strike the 8:30, the notes echoed strangely in Hiram's mind, as though time itself were standing still. When Hiram opened his eyes, he felt that the night fog had entered the room, for it was chill despite the crackling log fire, and all about him was a grayish swirl. Hiram reached for his glasses but he could not find them. Then, as he stared into the mysterious mist, his vision cleared, and the swirl took on a human form that spoke the name Hiram. Instantly, Hiram was wide awake and gazing into the face of his brother, John, a face he had not seen in years, in which had appeared to him quite often in dreams. On this occasion, however, the appearance was too vivid, too fearful, to be mere a dream. John's solemn face, his gaunt form, clad in its simple garb of black, were real enough. In a way, too real. His features were smeared with blood, and that shone crimson in the firelight, flowing from a gaping wound in his forehead. As Hiram watched his brother's figure swaying, and his hands came forward appealingly as he spoke again. Hiram, quickly, you must help, now. It may be too late for me, but there are others in danger. You must save them, now. Those twitching hands that reached Hiram's arm, he could feel their sudden clamp. He was staring squarely into John's strained face, and he saw his brother's eyelids close like miniature hoods. The jaw drooped, the corners of his lips sagged as Hiram clasped his own hands on his brother's. It was Hiram who spoke. John, you've come to me for help, but John, you're hurt. Hiram. The tone came like a knell. I'm dying. No, John, you can't be dying. I am dying. I am dying, Hiram. I am dead. John's figure swayed, and Hiram tightened his grip to steady him, but too late. The fire crackled, a burning log fell forward, and smoke gushed from the fireplace, clouding the wavering figure, which again took on a misty shape. Hiram, choking from the smoke, lowered his head, and as he was seized by a coughing spell. When he looked up, the smoke was gone, and John's ghost had literally evaporated with it. Hiram looked at his hand, thinking that it clamped his brother. Instead, Hiram's grip was upon his own arm. Baffled, he sank back into the chair and closed his eyes. As he tried to reconstruct the scene, his mind went back to the start. Somehow Hiram linked it to 8 o'clock, and the echo of the strokes from the big town hall clock came to his memory like a dirge. But had he really heard the clock strike 8, or had that been an earlier dream with the time lapse following it? Hiram opened his eyes, almost expecting to see John again. He did sight the strange gray swirl, but now it was beyond the bay window. Hiram went to the window, opened it, and stared out at the actual fog. It was coming from the Wabash, and through it, the filtering light of the rising moon produced an effect that was truly uncanny. More uncanny than Hiram realized, the scene on the Wabash resembled another far down the mighty Mississippi, hundreds of miles away. Instead of Indiana, this could have been Louisiana. The bay windows of the parlor above the family store that Morelands had tended for 3 generations was oddly like the plot house of a Mississippi steamboat. Nothing could be seen except the billowing fog, which gave Hiram the impression that he was drifting somewhere, perhaps down the river. Then, like a tocsin, Tocsin, the town clock clanged. Hiram Moreland waited, expecting 7 more strokes to follow the first. Perhaps it was just now 8 o'clock. For though Hiram's mind flashed the thought that he might have dreamed of something due to happen, that his real experience was about to occur right now, but only that one dong came from the town hall clock. The bell had struck the half hour. Hiram turned up a kerosene lamp and looked at his own clock on the mantel. It said 8:30. His dream must have been intermittent, covering half an hour. All that time, perhaps, John had been trying to get his message through, and Hiram had either missed much or had been slow to comprehend. From below there came a sudden pounding at the door, verifying Hiram's thought that something still was due. Then an excited voice was calling. Uncle Hiram, we need you. Please hurry. We need you right away. Hiram put on his hat and an overcoat, went downstairs, opened the back door of the store, and found his nephew, Terry Pendleton, waiting there with a horse and buggy. Before Hiram could inquire what had happened, the youth told him. Mother's had another of her spells, Terry blurted out. She's talking about Uncle John and calling for you. We thought you had better come out to the house. Dad said you would understand. I do understand. They rode for 5 miles out into the country to a large, pretentious farmhouse where Hiram's sister Esther lived with her husband, Roger Pendleton, and their 2 children. Roger was waiting on the front porch with his daughter Sue, and they were glad to see Hiram. They were both glad to see Hiram. We're going to call the doctor, Roger told Hiram, but maybe if Esther talks to you first, she'll be all right. It's like those other times when she called for you, only now she thinks she's dying. She keeps looking far away and saying, I'm dying, in a kind of gaspy voice. Let me talk to her. They ushered Hiram into an upstairs bedroom where his sister was lying on the pillows. Esther looked up but saw nothing until Hiram had waved the others from the room. Then, you've seen John again, Esther paused. As plainly as I'm seeing you right now, Hiram. Another pause. Then her eyes became sharp and bright. She asked, Have you seen him? Hiram nodded solemnly, and Esther added, I've seen John for the last time. I know. He was dying, Hiram. He said so. Did he say that to you too? Hiram nodded again. I felt it here, continued Esther, pressing her hand to her heart, and I called the words that I could hear from far away. I'm dying, and I called so loudly that the family heard me and came rushing in, thinking I meant that I was dying, but I meant John. That's why I sent for you, because you were the only one who would understand. I know, Esther. Tell me more about it. It was just before 8 o'clock, because that's when Sue brought me my medicine, as she always does. It was just after Sue left. Sue, isn't that odd? It doesn't strike me as odd, Esther. It will when I get to that part. I had just taken the medicine, and it had brightened me. As it so often does. When I heard John's voice, I was right here in the room. It was right here in the room, and was saying, Esther, I'm all alone tonight, but soon I'll be coming home. You hear me, don't you? I was answering, yes, John, when another voice interrupted. Was it close by, too? Not at first. It seemed to be coming in from the hallway, saying, Now listen to me, Moreland. And John's voice was saying, I'll settle this matter right now. Then there was a clatter all about me, and I shut my eyes until it ended. Esther closed her eyes and leaned back on the pillows in a dreamy tone. She continued, Then I heard bells, Hiram, steamboat bells, like those other times. Yes, and I opened my eyes. Everything was misty. It seemed to be I seemed to be floating somewhere. And all the while I was listening, hoping to hear John's voice again, but all I could hear was the steady thrumming sound and occasionally a moan. Hiram pondered, taking all that Esther said as something very real. The thrumming could have been the steamboat engines, Hiram decided, and what you thought was a moan might have been the creaking of the pilot house. It was more like a human moan, Esther insisted, but I couldn't make out any words. Then came the odd part that I mentioned. I heard music, loud and wheezy, like a showboat. Perhaps I dreamed it because Sue had brought my medicine. But what has Sue to do with it? The music was Oh, the music was playing Oh, Susanna. It became louder and then drifted away. Then I could hear the moans again. This was very real, Hiram, and gradually they grew into a voice. John's voice? Yes. That's when I could hear him calling, I'm dying, and I started screaming it myself. That's when the family came rushing in, asking me what was the matter, but I couldn't tell them because they wouldn't have believed me, and besides I wanted to hear John's voice. And you did? Yes, I was calling John's name, and yours, knowing you'd understand. Next thing, they were sending Terry to bring you, and I was lying here listening to John's voice. You must help now. There are others in danger. You must save them. John's voice kept repeating those words. Hiram. I know, Esther. I heard them too. And then I heard him say, I'm dying. And he did before and then. Oh, as he did before. And then you heard him say, I am dead. What was that what you heard? Yes, but that was not quite all. Just before John spoke, I heard a sound like a steamboat whistle. Then came his words, I am dead. After that, the whistle came again, but closer. Everything seemed to crash about me, and the room went black. And you heard nothing more? Nothing more. When I opened my eyes, the fog was gone, and they were bringing you in to see me. Did you hear from John too? Yes, we have both heard from him for the last time. From Hiram's tone, Esther saw he was convinced that John was really dead. She nodded sadly as Hiram pressed her hands between his own. Hiram felt a sudden pang, for it reminded him of his recent vision, when he imagined that he had pressed John's hands in farewell. But Hiram did not mention that to Esther because she was resting easily now, apparently willing to accept the inevitable. Just checking to make sure. Once back at the store, Hiram wrote down all that his sister had told him, for her account was much more detailed than his own. Also, Esther had experienced events in sequence, so that Hiram's detached impressions were merely pegs that helped verify the whole. But Hiram had a sense the physical presence and actual contact of his brother John, factors too substantial for mere dream stuff. The only course now was to wait for the news that would surely come. 2 days later, the morning mail train brought the newspaper up from Indianapolis. They were filled with headlines that detailed reports of the Mississippi Steamboat disaster when the Dixie Bell had run into the Colossus a few miles south of the town called Bonneville. The account said that the collision was due to a thick fog and that John Moreland, pilot of the Dixie Bell, had died a hero, staying at his post. The crash had occurred at approximately 8 o'clock, and though the fires of the furnace of the Dixie Bell had been stoked, she was racked by an explosion when the water reached them. That, however, was after she had grounded an hour later. By then, the pilot's body had been removed, and other fatalities were very few, though the Dixie Bell herself was a total loss. Roger Pendleton was at the store soon after the newspapers were delivered, anxiously asking Hiram's advice about breaking the news to Esther. Hiram took that duty upon himself. He went out to the farm where he read the news to Esther as they sat alone together in her room. All Esther said was, I wish someone had been there to tell us more about how John died. Still, if he hadn't been alone, he wouldn't have called for us. When he saw that monstrous sight loom out of the fog. Esther was quoting the report of an eyewitness aboard the Dixie Bell who had described to a reporter the sudden appearance of the Colossus. An artist, too, had done a pen and ink sketch of the crash, rendering it all the more vivid. Hiram nodded agreement to what Esther said, but he was wondering about other details. He did not broach those to his sister until after John's body had been brought back to Newbury. Then they stood together beside the open grave in the Moreland family plot. Hiram said to Esther, "If John only could have told us all that happened. There must have been more to this than either of us know, Esther." "Much more, Hiram," Esther agreed. "John tried to tell us, though. Maybe some day we shall know." A month after the funeral, Hiram Moreland was seated in his upstairs parlor. Another foggy night. Again, the town hall clock struck 8, snapping Hiram from his reverie. Then, as he dozed off again, gradually, he awoke suddenly to see his brother John standing beside him. We're going to stop it here. Hey, I hate to leave it on a cliffhanger, but, wow, there's still a long way. This is still a pretty long story. That's pretty good. Anyways, we've been reading from Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, 26 Unforgettable Explorations into the Realm of the Supernatural. And it's adapted by Walter B. Gibson. Now, we've been specifically reading The Ghost of the Dixie Bell. Anyways, if you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe, ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, want to support me in any way, if you want to join the Discord server, all the information will be in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.